Hallo und herzlich willkommen. Welcome to another English episode here at 99:1. If you're listening to 99:1 for the first time, we are a leftist platform trying to cover everything interesting from news to political theory to culture. My name is Hannah and I'm your host for today. I have to apologize beforehand. I'm not a native in English and this is my first English episode, but bear with me because today's topic and guest is going to be worth your time. Today, we are going to talk about love, desire, Eros, and their relationship and relation to capitalism. In short, Eros and Alienation, which is also the title of the new book by Alan Sears. And yeah, I have the honor of having Alan here today. Let me get him into the room.
Thank you.
Alan.
Hi, great to meet you.
Yeah, really great having you here. I really appreciate that. Before we start with the questions, I would briefly introduce you. You are a professor of sociology at the Toronto Metropolitan University. You have been writing both for academic and activist audiences, and some of your books include a good book in theory, Making Sense Through Inquiry, The Next New Left, A History of the Future, and The Democratic Imagination Envisioning Popular Power in the 21st Century. You've been also publishing at the New Socialist Web Scene, The Bullet, and other places, and you're also considering yourself an activist. Okay, did I forget anything that you might want to add?
That was beautiful, thank you.
Okay, great. Then I'd say we start with a question or problem, or the context that your book might be situated in, and that makes it also interesting for us. So from a Marxist perspective, meaning Marxism, meaning theory about capitalist production and consumption, I don't think it's so easy, and has been in the past as well, to find solid explanations for gender and sexuality related phenomena. Violence against women and queers exists incomparably more than violence against men. We have femicides and other phenomena, and above all, gender-specific roles and appearances. So what is your approach to this, to explain this?
It's a big question to start with, which I really appreciate. And so I think maybe I'll start by the idea that capitalism, in terms of the formation of a working class, has two tendencies. One of them, which Marxism has talked about a lot, is essentially homogenization, is stripping workers of their individuality and of other categories and making them interchangeable, de-skilled, almost cogs in a machine. And so any one of them is hireable in a factory. Any one of them can be fired. If they go on strike, you can get rid of them. So that homogeneity is actually an advantage in certain ways to capitalism. And I think Marxism has captured that a lot and paid a lot of attention to it. And it is indeed one of the tendencies of capitalism, and indeed an important one. On the other hand, though, one that Marxism, I think, has sometimes paid less attention to is there's also a core strategy of differentiation, of divisions of labor that are not only about people doing different things, but about hierarchies. And depending on where one is in terms of relations of gender, racialization, colonialism and imperialism, classification as disabled, sexuality, and so on, one fits into the system differently, and that is also hugely important to the profitability and sustainability of the system. And I think that isn't just an add-on or separate from class or whatever. It's actually central to the character of class. And I think because Marxists haven't emphasized that, or at least many Marxists haven't emphasized that enough, there tends to be an idea that first you have this analysis of this essentially homogenized working class with a particular relationship to the means of production in a technical sense and so on. And then you have these other issues added in. And so you try to explain them on top of what you've already done. You add an extra explanation for gendered violence and violence against women, sexual assault, and so on, as opposed to thinking actually at the core of these hierarchical divisions of labor are all these processes of dehumanization and differentiation that mean that it's not only about gender being different, but about a hierarchy. And how do you reproduce that dehumanization? How do you create it? And what conditions does it create? And it seems to me, when we're starting to talk about things like sexual violence, gendered violence, and violence against women specifically, we have to look at its connection to dehumanization and to those kinds of hierarchies. I hope that begins to address it.
Yeah, definitely. So basically, like what you're saying reminds me of the differentiation. I don't know the English words for it, but Unterbau, Überbau stuff. Like with the basic level of explaining stuff, the capitalist production, and then having the other explanation to add on. So what you're saying is to have this situated within the realm of capitalism, not as an add-on, but like fundamentally within it. That approach is called, or I think you call it as well, queer Marxism. Let's start there. What is the relation between capitalism and gender roles, stereotypes, and sex then?
Yeah, so I mean, basically, I guess the reason I call it queer Marxism is because I came to it through queerness, and essentially through the project in my own life of integrating my queer life, which involved certain kinds of activism and so on, and my life in a Marxist organization beginning in the early 1980s, when the organization that I joined in Canada, which was called the International Socialists, had done some of the work, but they still felt somewhat separate. These different worlds, these different literatures, these different ways of knowing. And to me, the fun part or the playful part of putting them together is that it's not only about Marxism focused on queer experience, but it's also on queering Marxism, on estranging Marxism from the way we've understood it at times, not because it's wrong, but because often our understanding of the tool chest of Marxism is partial. And that's true. That's going to be true forever. You know, like no one's going to just get it. It's not a calculus question where you finally get it right, because the world keeps throwing new problems at us, rightly so. New people mobilize in different ways. New questions get asked. And what I think we find is that there's a richness at the core of Marxism that needs to be teased out more in terms of dealing with some of these questions. And that richness has sometimes been underutilized because Marxists felt satisfied with tool chest that they put together, and at times even hardened it into party lines, and the idea that if you ask other questions, you're distracting from the fundamental. And to me, the idea of these integrations, and because queer was my way in, I think of it as queer Marxism, but really it would be the mouthful of saying queer, anti-racist, anti-colonial, feminist, ecological, disability rights, you know, all those. It's a Marxism that begins to think all those things, not because it's that changes the whole system, but because it requires us to rethink it with a different kind of breadth in some ways.
Yeah, and the main concept that your book suggests is then alienation, alienation by wage labor relations, and that you write that is the decisive factor for an anti-queer attitude. You already hinted at that in your first answer, but the notion of alienation is not that easy, I think, to grasp. How would you define it?
Yeah, and so I will say, I'll just start briefly by saying it's almost an autobiographical accident that as I joined a Marxist organization, I happened to be in a Marxist theory class at the university taught by someone who started, we worked through chronologically, and alienation was very early in Marx. So that hit me at the same time. And I instantly found something attractive about the concept, which it has sometimes been underused subsequently. Indeed, some of the issues, at least in English, some of the key publications that Marx wrote having to do with alienation were actually not available in English for a long, long time, and so on. So it was neglected. And to me, the core of it is to say humans are at our core makers. It's one of the most defining characteristics is that we creatively work on the world around us. We not only harvest nature for the things we want, and we not only take the pre-existing things that are out there, but we process everything, we transform it, we actually create the needs, the hunger for the foods that we harvest for nature, so that all foods don't equally feed our hungers. And we begin to process, not in the sense I'm talking about of industrial processing of food, but we begin to, for example, cook. We do things in all kinds of different ways. Different cultures develop different meanings associated with food. And so it's not simply a question of sustaining ourselves off the harvest of nature, but producing and creating ourselves socially and individually as we do that by making our mark on the world. And if you just think of children at play and how children, and as they're playing, are constantly acting on the world around them, and sometimes in ways that make adults like want to scream, because you take the crayon and you put it on the wall because you're putting your mark on the world quite literally. You're transforming things, and a stick can be a car, it can be a football, it can be whatever. And the use of mental, physical, spiritual transformation is something we learn from the youngest age. And the idea of alienation starts with this idea that one of the beautiful things about people is our creative capacity as makers. And there's a certain open-endedness to that. Because we are makers, because we're transforming, because we're using our ideas and our bodies together to work on the world, that we're always creating anew and trying things slightly differently, and so on. And capitalism as a system of subordinated labor, where rather than our open-endedness work on the world, because it's self-fulfilling. That's the thing about people as makers. We're not just making because someone says, get off the couch and go do something. We're makers because first and foremost, we want to engage in the world. We find that fulfilling as individuals and socially. And it's not only about keeping ourselves alive, though that's certainly part of it, but it's also about realizing ourselves in all the senses, like actually making ourselves. And a system of subordinated labor to make us work as essentially drones, as the people who will follow orders, as the people who will show up at 9 o'clock in the morning, no matter if our child is sick, if our parent has dementia, if we are feeling really crappy that day, whatever it is, or if we have a religious reason not to be there that day. What will make us actually show up and do what they say, even though it's tedious and not self-fulfilling? How do we do that? And that is the core of alienation. It's the loss of that inherent fulfillment through making. And instead, what we do becomes a means to an end. So the classic thing is, in a classic employment situation, rather than doing the work because it's fulfilling, which working at McDonald's or so many other things is not. The job is not designed to be fulfilling. Everything that's actually fulfilling is taken out of it. The discretion, the creation, the experimentation, all that is engineered out of the process. So you come exactly to turn yourself off. Yeah. And alienation is about that ability to turn yourself off. And if you think of it, to turn yourself off as a creator is not only a mental attitude or a physical discipline, it also means, for example, turning off your erotic impulse, because this fulfillment, this inherent fulfillment that we get through creating, through acting on the world, this inherent fulfillment includes erotic dimensions. And the turning off of our inherent fulfillment also means an erotic turning off.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's now a bit clearer. I also want to add, with the fulfilling, even if a job would be fulfilling, if you consider your job to be fun or something, just by the fact that you have to do it, and you will have to do it even if you're sick or at some point just don't want to, by that even the fulfilling is cut off.
Exactly. I mean, I just think of university teaching. I happen to have had a job that actually does have inherent fulfillments for me, not for everyone who's a university teacher. It happened that like there's aspects of it I loved. I learned so much from students, all that kind of stuff. But the fundamental relationship is still not about my fulfillment or theirs.
Yeah.
It's about grading, it's about standardization, and it's about essentially deferring our curiosity and deferring the actual excitement of learning, which is embodied. You know, a lot of people can't sit still. That's not an unhealthy thing necessarily, not to be able to sit still. But then you have a 3-hour lecture, and it becomes an endurance test for a lot of the people in the room. So even something that you're absolutely right to point that out, that even something that can be inherently fulfilling, the fact that you're doing it not for the fulfillment, and the way that the whole thing gets designed as so that the labor itself becomes a means to an end rather than an end in itself, means that even the most fulfilling things, and you know, one of the things that we're contradictory about, that I think is right to keep contradictory about, is because we are makers, we can find fulfillment in a lot of different things. And so I remember I used to teach in Windsor, Ontario, and was fortunate, which is the automobile manufacturing capital of Ontario, and was fortunate to get to meet a lot of automobile unionists. And some of them talked about things that they did despite, like they would invent slightly new processes that gave them a bit of control over the pace of work at their station, even though the process engineers, one of them showed me a tool that he'd make. Others would steal nuts and bolts and stuff like that and do art at home with the stuff they'd stolen from work. People still find ways to find fulfillment, but the jobs itself tend to be engineered to try to squeeze that out.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think we have to stay at the notion or at the state that one gets alienated from by wage labor, which you already described as human beings as makers. And the notion that you use for that, like the activity that you use for that, is you call it life-making activity. And you already hinted at that, but I think we have to make it clear even more, because this notion, I think, is really important, and I find it also really interesting. So what's the relation between life-making activity, wage labor, and maybe already, if you want to explain it at once, reproductive labor?
Yes, and thanks for asking that, because basically, thanks to the work of Tithi Bhattacharya and Sue Ferguson and some others, and then over a longer period, Lise Vogel and other Marxist feminists, I was exposed to social reproduction theory and began to realize the connection between that and queer Marxism in really important ways. And traditionally, Marxism has often focused a lot at what's sometimes called, at least the point of production, the site of wage labor. And there's no doubt that that's hugely important. But as Tithi writes in one of the things that she wrote, it doesn't ask the question, how did the worker arrive at that place? And if we don't ask that question, we miss a whole side of the relations that are absolutely central to capitalism, but are not done directly a lot of the time, because certainly some of these things can become profit centers and wage labor. And if you look at the difference between childcare unpaid in the household, childcare paid in the household, poorly paid, childcare paid in a childcare center, and the school, you find out that actually there's different kinds of wage relations that can be involved and so on. But we need to start with the ensemble of how does life get sustained? Yeah. And how does that happen under capitalism? And what we find under capitalism is that on the one hand, there's wage labor, which is supposed to be the only way, essentially, to gain access to the resources to life. The welfare state offers very limited and highly bounded off alternatives. But aside from that, if you don't engage in wage labor, or someone in the household doesn't engage in wage labor, you essentially are condemned to poverty, isolation, and so on, unless you're rich. And we'll leave that one aside, because that's not relevant for most of us. So the household is dependent on wage labor, but it's also dependent on this privatized responsibility to keep ourselves alive, and to essentially build the relationships that can sustain us, to care for each other, to care for the people who can't be employed for various reasons, to care for each other through the life cycle, to prepare food, to look appropriate for the place that we work. Certainly a feminist labor studies person, friend, Anne Forrest, years ago said, why do we not, when we're talking about wage labor, but why do we never talk about, for example, women working in stores have to spend a lot of time looking the way that they're supposed to look to show up to work. And if you think of it, therefore, that combination of paid and unpaid labor is actually much more complex. So life-making is a terminology that is trying to draw all those things together. How do we sustain ourselves in this system? And how do we keep life going? And what's the combination of what's unpaid or poorly paid, tending to be gendered, the caregiving work, and tending to be racialized when it's paid? So that often the paid reproductive labor is, at least in Canada, I'm just not as sure about Germany, but it wouldn't surprise me at all, but tends to be highly racialized and highly gendered.
Yeah, definitely it's the same.
Yeah. And so what are the processes through which that happens, and how do we understand those things aren't separate, and one isn't more capitalist than the other, and also one isn't necessarily more important in the struggle than the other? We need to think of both. And I'll just give one quick example just to end this answer, which tell me if I'm being too verbose at any time, but in 1945, there was a very important strike in the auto industry in Windsor, Ontario, which really won a lot of the collective bargaining and union rights that became central to the labor law in post-war Canada. And one of the things that I got to meet some of the people who participated in that strike when I was teaching there. One of the things that they talked about is the work in the community to sustain the strike, because they didn't have strike pay. They needed to feed their families, even though they were on strike. And that the work that women did, and it was disproportionately women in the community, it was a very male workforce, a deliberate management strategy, by the way, to hire men. But it was women in the community doing a lot of that work that was absolutely essential to the strike's ability to last for 99 days. And that gets written out of a lot of labor history. It's what happened on the picket line. Well, and those things are all important. I'm not trying to say we shouldn't be covering those things, but what about asking the question, how do the strikers stay alive? What happens to their children when they're on strike? All those things.
So basically, if I understand you correctly, then there's this concept of life-making activity, which is, of course, necessarily always present. We have to do that in order to stay alive. But within capitalism, it is alienated. And also the time that we use for it is maybe split into several spheres, like the reproductive sphere, the productive sphere, and maybe free time or something like that. And with that differentiation of time, also the alienation of Eros is then arguably produced. What exactly do you mean by Eros, by the term?
So I'm using Eros in a fairly broad sense. And I think I really appreciate when people ask that, because we often think of the erotic fairly narrowly in this society as the sexual. And we often think of the sexual in terms of very specific parts of our bodies, genitalia, breasts, and so on, and very specific activities with those parts of the body. I remember even years ago when I was doing volunteer AIDS education and going into schools and places like that and doing volunteer AIDS education in the early 1990s. And one of the things I'd say is, well, how does HIV get transmitted? And people would say the sex act. And I would say, which one? And that would always lead to a confusion, because they thought that was obvious. The most obvious thing you could say is the sex act. And we think of Eros often in terms of the sex act. And what I'm drawing on Freud and other thinkers influenced by Freud, I'm using it in a broader sense to say that there is this meeting point of embodied pleasure, all the different kinds of satiation that you can get through your body, and social connection. And that Eros is where those two things meet, but they can meet in a bunch of different ways. And I think when you look at the more recent literature, at least in English, on crip sexualities, disability activists talking about sexuality from the point of view of people living with disabilities in various ways. One of the things that people talk about in that literature is the need to broaden our sense of erotic fulfillment, especially considering that some people can't do what is considered to be the sex act. Does that mean that they're asexual? Maybe. And asexuality is also, there's all kinds of different options and ways that people can live out their embodied fulfillment and so on. But there's a whole range of different kinds of fulfillment that have to do with connection with others and with embodied fulfillment. And so I'm using Eros as that meeting place, and it's a broad term. And then sexualities in the way that we think of it, and especially gendered sexualities and genital-centered sexuality, is simply a fairly small subset of that we almost talk about as if that's now the exclusive realm of the erotic.
Yeah, all right. And how is the term desire connected to it? Like,
and that's a good question. And desire, the way I understand it, though, one of the things that's so complex in these things is that everyone uses these terms in very specific ways, and it can vary from one conversation to another. And I am very aware of that. I think of desire in the way that I'm using it in the book as essentially the hunger for Eros. And so just like our hunger for foods can take different forms depending on our cultural upbringing, our own personal responses to our family of origin, our own ethical and so on decision-making, our own relations with our own bodies. People have very different hungers. And I think desire is the word that we tend to use for those erotic hungers that get tuned up in various ways by biography, but also sociologically and historically by our social location.
All right. And you already addressed it a bit, but I'd appreciate if you go more specifically into the concrete examples of how gender and Eros is then effectively influenced by the alienation through wage labor relations.
Yeah, so I think one of the things, Marxism, as it developed the theory of alienation in Marx, and also as it's developed subsequently, a lot of the focus, there's kind of been two tendencies. One of them has been to focus exclusively on the realm of wage labor, and to say alienation is something that happens once you're paid for the work and your wage becomes the end and your labor becomes a means to an end, which is to get the wage. And the account of alienation, the loss of inherent fulfillment and so on, fits very clearly with the case of wage labor. But and some people just apply it super broadly as it's almost like a psychological state. And I'm somewhere in between. I'm saying it's related to labor, but not only to wage labor, also reproductive labor. That when we're alienated, when we live in a society where our ability to fulfill our own needs, because we're dispossessed of control over the fundamental productive resources of society that we need access to eat, to play, to do whatever, to the space to live, all those things, that because we're doing that, we're constantly doing what society is asking of us, and there's rules in every realm. And so a Canadian Marxist feminist named Meg Lugston wrote a book called More Than a Labor of Love, talking about reproductive labor, and it's often described as a labor of love. It's not paid, you do it for the love, but obviously you talk to people actually doing that labor, and it can be exactly, completely, horrifyingly drudge-like, exactly like paid labor can. It can feel endless. It can feel like what you have to get through to become yourself. And how does that happen? Well, it's under-resourced, it's privatized responsibility, rather than collectively saying as a society, we need to make sure that this society is child-friendly, that children are fed, that there's places to play, that there's resources, and so on. Rather than that, it becomes the personal responsibility disproportionately of the mother to do all of that while also worrying about finances and where, and so you think of the weight that that becomes on people in all these different realms, and you begin to realize that alienation begins to affect our relationship with our bodies, with each other, at a most fundamental level. That rather than, we begin to think of essentially our body as property that we have to sell. And we are, so if you think of the way people prepare for relationships, for example, it's often an idea of how do I make myself attractive enough that people will be interested in me, rather than thinking about what you bring to a relationship or the complexities. These relationships are formed often supposedly on the basis of sexual attraction, and yet very little about them is often about sex. It's often about finances and companionship and raising children together, whichever, it's different for different people. Who will take care of you in old age? What happens if you get sick? All those kinds of things that have very little to do with it. And yet the way we produce it is by essentially externalizing our bodies and making them a calling card, working very hard to and so this alienation gets really deep. And it's not simply I'm human all the time, and then I go and at work I become an alienated drone. The droneness gets driven deep into us, and there are systems designed to do that. And as someone who is a formal educator hired at a state university and so on, the education system is a classic example of that, where rather than, curious, hungry, playful, creative children, starting with kindergarten, get taught to sit still, listen, and learn, not for a wage as such, but for a grade, which is the stand-in for the wage, the practice for it. And so think of how that creates a relationship with your own body, is that your own desire to move, which for a lot of kids, it's very, like kids are not the same. And movement means different things to different, but for some, there's a kineticness to a lot of kids that getting them to sit still is really a huge sacrifice on their part of everything that they are. And they've been out there actively exploring, courageously climbing trees, doing whatever it is. And then suddenly, no, it's sit still, listen. The wisdom comes from the front of the room, not from your own creativity. And if you think, and I'm just using that as one example of all these systems coming at us, that we end up essentially dumbing down, pushing down our creativity. And that includes the way that we essentially try to fit into tick boxes in terms of gender positions and sexuality. And if we don't, we end up being punished in all kinds of ways, by violence, by abuse, and so on, by not being considered desirable.
Yeah. No, really, when I was reading this, I could think about a lot of examples where I also would say that I experienced this. Before we get into, I think later we will talk a bit more about the thing of body as property and what that all means. But before that, I would, because I found it really interesting when reading your book, about how, because you were talking, for example, about this one thing that there was this policy at Ford where, by like a official management strategy, an image of masculinity was enforced on workers to make them endure their bad working conditions even more. And this example really, I think, describes vividly how from above, may it be the state or companies, how they are willingly influencing or using these gender categories as a strategy to control people and to make them comply to what they are facing. Could you elaborate on that a bit more?
Yeah, no, and this comes from a piece by a Canadian labor historian named Wayne Luchuk. And I think it's a wonderful piece that's been underused. And there are other pieces, and unfortunately, I don't have the names at the top of my mind right now, other relevant pieces also on Ford, because Ford, at least in North America, was regarded as the most innovative development of essentially the technologies of assembly line mass production. And there's a lot going on in terms of gendered and racialized strategies that are really deliberately done. Ford had something they called the sociology department for a period of time in the early 1900s that was actually supposed to be doing research on workers to figure out the problem of how do you make them work here? Because what happened when they first started mass production, it's not that surprising. Up until then, many jobs, not all of them, had required certain kinds of craft skills that are essentially taught between generations. So a classic form of that is the idea of apprenticeship. You're young, you learn from a more senior person, and that's the way you learn it. And that there's a certain pride in the craft and a certain fulfillment that comes with that. With mass production, it's so obvious. Like at that point, you really are at the point where there is absolutely no, and I'm not trying, like there were needle trades and so on in the 19th century. There's a lot of history that I'm kind of compacting a bit here. But with mass production on the assembly line, as in car plants, it's so obvious that people need to really work at the pace of the machine. It's noisy, it's smelly, it's dangerous. People are getting limbs cut off and all that kind of stuff. And there is absolutely no inherent fulfillment, and everyone knows it. And further, the pay was low. Because when you de-skill, one of the things that capital does when they put all that money into the machinery that does that is they say, we need less from you. You don't have to have discretion. You don't need to know what you're doing. So we will pay you less. And historically, those moments of de-skilling have often been associated with a feminization of the workplace. They begin to hire many more women because women had not been part of that skilled workforce, not because obviously women couldn't learn the skills, but because it was very specifically gender defined in a whole bunch of ways. But in the auto plants, they didn't. In fact, they hired more men and began to exclude women. So there was a deliberate strategy of hiring men. And at first, they were having these huge problems with massive turnover. People would just walk away, not show up. Absenteeism was massive. And none of that is surprising. So what they began to puzzle through. So what do we do? So one of the things was make the wage a little higher so it can be what they called a living wage. The idea that you could be a breadwinner for a family. And there are rewards in that, even if the job is crappy. The idea of you having this special place in a family as a result of what you're doing. But they also realize the job is painful. What about the masculine pride in enduring that pain? And so they began to work on an identity that was also racialized and also national, about this idea of I am a citizen, I am a breadwinner, I am supporting a family, I can put up with this crap, I can deal with this place. And this idea that gendered identity, that idea of masculinity, which is very specifically, you also then see a whole bunch of things like sports teams attached to the factory, like all this stuff to pump up that identity, that becomes a very specific kind of masculinity that right now, though I don't talk about that much in the book, and we're probably not going to get into it now, is in crisis because those kinds of jobs are much less there. But so that you end up with a very deliberate strategy to do that, and them thinking about what as management they can do to encourage that.
Yeah, I find that example really striking. I have to say, I would yeah, get back to what we talked before, the thing of the principle of body as property, and connected to that also the commodification of sexuality or eros, which is one of the big results of capitalism that you talk about. You also introduced the concept of market model relations, meaning relations based on exchange and on contracts between free individuals. My question would be, to what extent do you see this model really realized in a capitalist society?
Yeah, so I think that in any time you've got human relations, there's always the contradiction that people do bring some of their humanness to these relations, and we're never totally alienated. Our desire for embodied fulfillment and for human connection is deep, and people find ways to do it even in the most alienated systems and even in the most awful situations. But that gets overlaid in all kinds of ways. And so the idea of commodification is the idea that everything gets produced for exchange on the market, and we get used to paying for things and to getting things through the market in various kinds of ways. So if you bake a cake for yourself and eat it, it's not in that technical sense a commodity, though you've consumed commodities, usually making the cake, unless you actually grow your own wheat. So there's still market relations involved with the immediate cake production, but cakes produced for bakery are produced as commodities. And that this commodification gets very deep into the system. Marx wrote about commodity fetishism, that it's not only about the way that this becomes the primary means of distribution in society, but we begin to mystify commodities because they seem to have a power over us. It seems like the products of human labor actually, Marx makes it sound like they actually stand up on their feet and make demands on us. It's like the mall shuts down at night and the commodities all haggle and decide what the prices will be the next day. And it seems like factors beyond our control mean that suddenly oil is more expensive, or right now in cities around the world, housing is becoming more and more expensive. It seems like that's a force of nature. There's nothing we can do about it. And so you find out more and more people are unhoused, more and more people are underhoused. I believe that this is a huge problem in German cities. It's certainly a problem in Canadian cities. And the thing that has helped deal with that in certain ways has been a certain layer of decommodified social housing that was in post-World War II period, especially a feature of many cities, and sometimes pre-World War II in certain cases, and provided at least some access to decent housing, but that's been cut as part of neoliberalism. And so you end up with everything on the market, and it seems like these forces that control our lives. And we begin to hand over power. We actually wish we could be like them because they have power. The commodities have power. We don't. So we want to get into the power position. And so Marx wrote about how commodities begin to take on meanings that are not simply about the actual physical object, but, and Walter Benjamin wrote about almost window shopping, and how by looking at things, you think, if I had that, I would be attractive. If I had that, my life would be different. We begin to associate that kind of meaning that almost we lose our sense of ourselves, and that begins to affect all of our relationships. And so that's one level. The other, and by the way, one of the things is that commodities become highly sexualized. And that's, if you just think of advertising, advertising is a lot of the time is trying to sexualize beer, clothing, cars. I used to joke when I was doing AIDS education volunteer, everything but condoms, because when they started advertising condoms in Canada, they hadn't been legal to advertise as an AIDS prevention measure. They actually legalized the advertising of condoms, and they were advertised as safety devices in the most clinical language. So you'd have this really hot ad for a car, and then condoms are good for your health. You should use this kind of. So the sexualization of everything except sex. is there in commodification in all kinds of ways. Actual sex is surrounded by shame, silence. Even with intimate partners, people are unable to talk about it, according to studies at a social level and so on. But everything is sexualized. And so all that takes place in a society where we've also learned from a young age, because schooling is preparing us for eventual wage labor relations, to sell our capacities as the key thing to survive. And that's not simply ideological. It's not simply people have been told a bad thing. It's actually literally true. So when university students are obsessing with what will this get me afterwards, to me, that's not them being untrue to the world that they're in. I think they're actually being accurate. And I think often the professors who say, no, you should be inherently interested in the philosophy of being or whatever it is, are missing the point, especially for working class students, that, but I have to think about this. Because if I don't think about how I'm going to commodify this body, I don't have a life net. Maybe you did as a student, but and so you begin to realize that we learn these patterns, these forms of relationship, and that these forms of relationship have been extended into the intimate realm. That marriage and other laws had been primarily governed disproportionately by religion and by a whole bunch of other things. And I'm not trying to defend that and say that was better. No, but capitalism, in many ways, often because of the struggles of women and racialized people and queers for degrees of inclusion, because one of the things about those traditional forms of marriage is that they were often, it varied a bit from society to society, often extremely patriarchal in the most literal sense, that the fight for freedom, for bodily autonomy, actually became a fight to own my own body. Now, bodily autonomy becomes defined almost as ownership, and ownership so that you can exchange it, because the exchange of your body in relationships becomes essential.
Sorry, I wanted to get there because that was my question as well. You addresses it also in the book. I mean, looking at these market model relations, the question if you are like free, like that's the condition, right? To be a part of these markets, to these exchanges, that you own your body. And maybe you could go more into that. Like if you see this autonomy, which has been a goal for most, for many activist movements. If you see that, because that's also a critique of them, right? Like to remain there, criticizing that you're not the owners of your own body, you remain within the logic of exchange models being which they are, being the goal for like social relationships.
And so what happens is that very well-meaning, absolutely correct struggles for transformation end up, because they don't move beyond capitalist relations, trapped within a frame that ends up. And so when we talk about things like homonormativity, but also when we look in the early 20th century at how crucial feminist struggles were to a form of family relationship that has perpetuated often the second-class citizenship of women, violence against women, gendered violence, and so on. Not because of a failure of imagination or a lack of seriousness, or because people were dupes of the system, but because if you don't move beyond those relations and think about how deeply they affect us. And so the idea was that in the realm of sexuality, for example, especially for women and people who are racialized, they didn't have the bodily autonomy to say no. And if you look literally, for example, in Canadian law about sexual assault, husbands could not be accused of the sexual assault against their wives because it was regarded as a built-in part of the relationship that they had access, essentially, and that there was no such thing as consent. And so women rightly, and people who are racialized, because if you think Angela Davis wrote about how in relations of enslavement in the United States, sexual assault and violence against women was systemic. And so quite rightly, and that violence persisted even after the limited emancipation that happened in the end of formal enslavement, violence against racialized women, sexual assault against racialized women, and so on, continued to be disproportionately high. And so the struggle to say, I have a right to say no, is absolutely essential. It makes complete sense. We completely understand that. And yet the form that it's taken, that idea of consent, didn't come out of this realm, and in fact comes out of contract law and the idea of what makes a market exchange fair. And one of the key things in market exchange is that the parties need to be willing participants in the exchange. And so the standard becomes willing participation, but willing participation isn't free participation. There's a whole bunch of things. And the classic example in Marxism is that the labor contract is free in the sense that, unlike systems of enslavement or prison camp labor or whatever, the laborer can actually quit most of the time, but can actually quit. But what keeps them there, what keeps us there, is the needs that drive us there. And so it can be both a formally equal relationship based on consent and a relationship of exploitation. And if that's true in the realm of wage labor, mustn't it also be true in other forms of relations where gender dehumanization, because gender differentiation in a capitalist society is related to hierarchies and division of labor and to elements of dehumanization, that gender dehumanization means, and racialized dehumanization and so on, means that people are in a position where they have to consent, even though it is free consent, and sometimes not. I'm not trying to say, but even where it is free consent, you ask, why did they consent? And so if you think of a lot of the times in relationships when people are having sex, some of the calculation, and there is calculation involved because there is this exchange model, some of the calculation is, how can I keep this person? What do I have to put up with? Because this is, like for our kids, this is where the food is coming from. This is, and there are these things that are good about, and you end up weighing all those things off rather than saying this is unacceptable. I need my needs met. Let's talk about my needs, and so on. And so you end up with a model that comes out of capitalist market relations ending up being our model of intimacy, in part because of very important struggles by queers, by feminists, by anti-racists. And yet when it's caught within capitalism, we end up essentially treating ourselves and each other as market goods.
Yeah, thank you. I think that really made it a bit more clear. Would you say that there is something like a currency within those market model relations? And if so, if there's something as market value?
Yeah, and I think there is in some ways, and I think it ends up being a kind of allure that is highly commodified. The idea of what makes someone attractive. It's funny because it feels like it's something that's just coming from your body. It feels like this must be like the most hardwired thing about me, because you look at someone and you can think back, or many of us can probably, to younger ages and think of early crushes, images, and as those feelings that you don't understand and can't talk about begin to develop, how do they begin to focus externally, and how that happens. And you begin to think of how that sexual allure becomes something that we cultivate physically with commodities like clothes, all those kinds of things, and how much that is standardized by advertising and a whole bunch of other forces that teach us what a hot body looks like. And it's often not sustainable. It's actually often the images that we get that circulate are literally people who've deprived themselves of water and food and been shot in a studio with particular kinds of lighting and sometimes are retouched and all this kind of stuff. And then we hold ourselves up to that standard and each other up to that standard. And so we end up with these ideas. And so that's one kind of currency. The other thing I talk about a bit jokingly in the book, but in porn and the way that this has to do with a male dominance that remains a factor in heterosexual relationships, but remains a factor in the way we think about sexuality in society, is the idea in porn, there's something called the money shot, which is the idea that everything is leading up to the moment where a guy comes, and that is called the money shot. And I just playfully in the book thought a little bit about what does it mean if that's the currency. And I think often guys have been taught, have internalized ideas of their sexual fulfillment is the goal of the relationship. And they think of that very narrowly in terms of that moment, that a particular kind of orgasm. And so this performance of orgasm and a centering on male orgasm becomes a kind of currency too, that again may or may not have to do with what's fulfilling, because different people are fulfilled in very different ways and their erotic needs are very different. And the idea that it's simply about athletically learning to perform a certain kind of orgasm that is supposedly the core of all human fulfillment, when actually there's a lot more at stake, and there's a lot more, and people are so imaginative. And if you actually get people to talk about what it is and what they need, you'd end up with something very different than what we're doing now.
Yeah, I think the money shot really is a really good example for pinning, or for the reduction that happens from eroticism to sexuality. Like that really makes it quite clear.
Yeah, no, and I think, the porn, not only in its own sake, but the pornographication of popular culture in various ways, which we see in a lot of music performance and so on, means that those things aren't just kind of isolated off in a particular realm of dirty stuff, but it actually is a lot of the ways that people learn to think about their own bodies. And it becomes almost unthinkable to start with the question, what would make me fulfilled in this situation? And with other people, what's going to be mutually fulfilling? And what do we want from each other? What do we need from each other? How is that different from different people? And if you just think of, like I've been, partly because I'm getting older, I've been doing some reading about aging recently. And one of the things you realize is that some elderly people now are living in essentially touch deserts, where they have staff who sometimes will clinically handle them in a home for the elderly, but hugs, a lot of the kinds of touching that is so important for human fulfillment. And there are studies that show that it actually makes a clinical difference. Obviously, we're talking about bodily autonomy. We're talking about where one wants to be, where we're very clear that unwanted touching is the opposite of this. But this idea that touch is actually humanly necessary, and that a lot of people who are very vulnerable are actually being put in situations where they're getting very little of it, sometimes at times when cognitively they're less able to process other kinds of human connection. Anyway, yeah.
Yeah, let's get to a slightly different topic that you also write about. I just want to shortly talk about it. That is ecology, which you also include in your analysis. And you take the term of second nature by Neil Smith, which describes the result of human life-making activity on nature. And this is capitalism in the current and condensed form. How are sexualities related to the current second nature?
Yeah, and so when Neil Smith talks about second nature, it's this idea that the human fingerprint is always there. It's part of the way that we work on nature, and humans always, in their immediate ecosystem, make some differences, even if it's just the most simple thing of, if you pick up a piece of fruit that's fallen off the ground, it means that the seeds won't be there and you are making a difference in the ecosystem. Capitalism as a world system that brings everything within a particular kind of system and a drive for profit, which means a hunger for speed, a hunger for more, not because we are always have a hunger for more. Sometimes that's mistaken, that it's to think, oh, well, humans have endless appetite for everything. But actually that desire for more is simply about what's going to be profitable and how profits will happen. And it sticks, it means that humanity, especially as we've got into oil-centered capital development, the production of plastics and other synthetics, it means that the human fingerprint is no longer simply superficial or whatever, but has deeply transformed every space of nature. So that I'm right now in a place in relatively rural Ontario with a lot of woods. There's no old growth forests around here. Everything was chopped down as part of the process of colonization that was also about depriving Indigenous people of the land and attempting to cultivate it. Now forests have grown back in some areas, but that scale of plastic in the ocean and so on means that our fingerprints are everywhere, and that this is not only about all the problems that are there with climate change and all the very serious ecological issues. It's also about our relationship with our own body, with nature within. And our relationship with nature without and with nature within are both affected by this shift in ecological systems. That means our relations with each other, our idea that if we harvest nature, we have a responsibility to ensure the sustainability, even if selfishly, the sustainability, there's a kind of a mutuality that we need to work out, where we want to be able to develop sustainable practices so that we can keep doing what we're doing. But also that means thinking about the others involved, whether it's a tree, whether it's other species, and so on. And that those things get crushed in this system, those relations of mutuality. It all becomes about exploiting, using, extracting, and so on. And that those relationships are with other things, other species, world around us, but also with our own bodies. And that an ecological revolution requires a reestablishment of mutuality in all kinds of senses with each other, understanding the way colonial and racialized relations have created forms of ecological injustice that are highly racialized and highly geographically specific in a global system. We need to map all those things out based on mutuality and based on the idea that our relations are not only with other people and our responsibilities, but also with other species, with the planet around us in all kinds of different ways.
Yeah. Yeah, you already mentioned the fun part, which is getting rid of the second nature, basically, the revolution, however it would look like. My question would be, what do you mean by a permanent sexual revolution, apart or with the mutuality that you already addressed? And why would you see it as a necessary dimension of a political, economical, or social revolution?
Yeah, and so one of the beautiful things to me about the idea of revolution that's there in socialism from below in Marxist traditions is the idea that these are enormously creative processes. It's not only about the transfer of political power from one set of actors to another. It's about changing the experience of what it is to be human. And that isn't just something that happens day one of the revolution. You change the calendar, the French Revolution, they said now it's the year zero. You do that kind of stuff. It's actually the process of beginning for that we begin to develop new forms of relationship. And you find in high points of struggle, Germany in the 1920s and late 10s and 20s, for example, as there was the production of amazing insurgent capacities at the workplace, in communities, among military conscripts, soldiers and sailors, that these capacities express themselves in new forms of communality and in all kinds of experiments in living that were really, really important. And people begin to create new forms of democracy that are based more authentically in coming together in various ways, but also begin to create new forms of relationship in a whole bunch of different ways. And that revolutionary processes, therefore, are not simply about the formal transfer of deed of the means of production from the capitalists to us. That's certainly essential. But our ownership, and this is where we end up, because I don't know if this has happened in Germany, it's happened in Canada, it's happened in Argentina a lot recently, where workers, collectives have taken over capitalist workplaces for various reasons. The capitalists went out of business, the workers took it over, but then end up operating within a capitalist system and essentially exploiting themselves because they need to be competitive in a capitalist system, selling steel or whatever it is that they sell. It can't simply be the transfer of deed. It needs to be the transfer of relationships. We're building new forms of relationship, and that those are necessarily open-ended. This is where elements of utopian thinking, because Marxists have often been critics of utopianism, because at least in the 19th century, there were elements of utopian socialism that were about dreaming of a better world, but not about the question of how we get there. And we always need to be pretty hard about no, it's not good just having a great vision if we don't think about who are the agents, how does that process of transformation work. But the idea that that process of transformation is open-ended and can allow us to create things that we can't imagine now, because on the basis of new forms of relationship, and some things may be simpler. Technology may be way simpler, who knows? This is probably maybe my old person bias. Or it may not be. I don't know. But the idea that once people have that kind of collective and democratic power and can actually begin to say, not only on a mass scale, what do we need, but on an individual level, what do I need? You begin to find out that the experience of being human shifts. And to me, the political revolution in that narrow sense, the workers' revolution in the sense of paid labor and so on, can only really be successful if it's a human revolution. And the beautiful thing about every revolution that we've seen so far is that there's always elements of that. But Marxism hasn't always theorized all those elements. They've been there in all kinds of experimental ways. And what does it mean to begin to theorize all those elements together? And to understand that that's going to be an ongoing process. It's not like suddenly we'll get it right. Oh, good. 2026, we'll finally get it right. And we can then say, now we've got it. Because some new question is going to come, or something that we always ignored that was right in front of us. For example, Indigenous sovereignty in Canada, that a lot of Marxism didn't pay a lot of attention to in Canada, even though it's not like that's a new issue. But it was Indigenous resurgence and political struggles that meant that anyone who was taking Marxism seriously had to rethink a lot of things that they talked about what class looked like in Canada. And I'm just using that as one example.
Yeah. But definitely, I would agree with you that one step of getting somewhere is definitely like also finding an understanding of what the problems that we are dealing with, what they are, and what are the reasons for them. So definitely, I would even go further with the transformation of power being anything near my concept of revolution. Maybe it's something like the abolishment of power or something like that. But
yeah, no, I think that puts it beautifully. I think, and the language of abolitionism has been used a lot more recently to talk about prisons, policing. Black Lives Matter pushed that language forward in a lot of ways. And I think the question of abolition of the state, all those kinds of things is absolutely central to what we're thinking about, is what does it mean to develop new forms of popular and collective democracy that replace what we now think of as power. So I think that the way you just put it is very powerful.
Yeah, but even more so, I think that your book really contributes to a understanding of the things that we are dealing with. And especially, we were talking about it earlier, like really the vision or the formation from Eros, the reduction of Eros to sexuality. And to add like maybe my personal interest is that I couldn't not think of this working kind of analogously to the split or the differentiation of time, which we are dealing with in capitalism, like that we have the time that we are subjected to a time regime where we have wage labor and reproductive labor, and then also free time, and I found that really interesting. I wanted to ask, how you would you see this time differentiation that I described? I don't know if it's clear. Would you say that there's a similarity, or that it compares to what you say with the development of Eros?
Yeah, no, and I think I was really excited in our initial exchange that you mentioned that that's an issue that interests you particularly, because I think it's fascinating how central time is. Like if you read in Capital, there's all kinds of stuff about the reduction of socially necessary labor time and so on through technology. So there's definitely references to it, but it's underexplored often in the more experiential side of Marxist theory. So E.P. Thompson talked about time discipline and how it's not only about the division of time, but it's about how all kinds of cyclical rhythms and relations, like it getting dark and so on, get disrupted by the idea that at a particular moment, you're supposed to be in a particular place. And that place that started all that time discipline was the workplace, the place of paid employment. There were other kinds of work going on in the community, obviously, that were unpaid. And the idea that what you got in towns, people didn't have watches. Sometimes there was a town square clock, and you still see that in older communities in smaller towns in Germany, for example, the clock that's there in City Hall Square or whatever, that's the only clock. But you had bells, and so that the bells would summon workers to work. And E.P. Thompson writes, school bells then developed to try to begin internalizing this discipline of responding to the bell and showing up at a younger age, so that by the time you got older, you're used to that. And the idea that time is not only broken up, but there's external control that goes with a lot of that. And without realizing it, we're submitting ourselves to a regime of control that we begin to think of, and as my control, but punctuality has built into it. In this system, also this idea of this time and space control over where you are at a particular time and what happens there. And the idea that the erotic is time confined. Like to me, it became really clear, if I'm allowed to use a bad word on the podcast, but I was at a Marxist historical materialism theory conference in London, and this Paul Reynolds stood up and said, there's all this interesting stuff going on, but no one's talking about time to fuck. And as he elaborated a bit, what he was actually saying, at least to me, isn't it interesting that under cover of darkness, once you've done all your reproductive and productive labor, once all that's done, the kids are in bed, the dishes are washed, the wages are put in the bank and so on, then there's time for sex. And what if we thought about Eros at noon, when we're feeling, not everyone is a noon person, we're all different, or whenever it is. What if it was at the peak of sun, of open time, of brightness, and so on? And how does this temporal confinement of different things, so that the idea of, in school in Canada, I'm not sure if it's the same, but when I was a kid, there was something called recess. So the idea is that you did your class and then there was a little bit of playtime in the schoolyard and then you're back in the class. You're allowed to play for this amount, 15 minutes period. And that whole way that the day gets regimented temporally is related to these regimes of control. And Jonathan Martineau writes brilliantly about this. And I just find that the confinement, the temporal confinement and spatial confinement of the erotic is part of this process of alienation that we often begin to normalize. We begin to think, no, privacy, please, privacy makes sense. And I'm not saying that people don't have a right to privacy and that privacy may not be important to people, but where does that privacy come from? Is it about a shame and a blockage and essentially compulsion not to have that as part of your life in certain places? So I appreciate, I don't know if this is addressed, but I'm glad that you're thinking about temporality in these ways, because to me, it's a really essential part of thinking about the way capitalism works, not only as an external system of exploitation and so on, but actually how it gets right inside of it. Us, and I'm old. I still wear a watch. If it's not a watch, it's your device of some sort. But people are always looking at it and very aware of it and regulating themselves according to it, and beginning to now measure, therefore, how many footsteps, and that idea of all these metrics is really associated with temporality.
Yeah, I think to sum this up, maybe one could really say that something like self-determined time is the necessary thing that needs to be established in order to have something as a realization of Eros.
Yeah, I think that puts it beautifully. And I think one of the things that you then realize is self-determination is therefore never completely individual, because if it's completely individual, you and I won't meet. So it is self-determined, but it's also self-determined in the social sense. And one of the beautiful things to me about Marxism is it always relates that individual and social sense of self-determination. You need both. So you do need that personal control, but you also need some sort of system of sociability at the same time. And how do those things go together? That's the challenge. But at the core of it, I agree completely, is this idea of self-determination in the individual and collective sense.
You're right. I would say that might be a good point to finish this conversation, if you don't have anything else that you want to add.
No, that was great. I really, really appreciate your thoughtful questions. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Really, from my side, I thank you so much for your time and presence here today.
Well, thank you.
Hope to hear you soon.
Yes, no, I really appreciate this. Thank you.
Same.
Leute, wir brauchen eure Hilfe. Wenn euch dieses Video gefallen hat, klickt auf Like, abonniert den Kanal und vergesst nicht das Glöckchen zu drücken, damit ihr benachrichtigt werdet, wenn wir neuen Content droppen.
Außerdem solltet ihr uns überall folgen, wo wir verfügbar sind. Das ist Facebook, Instagram, Twitter und Twitch. Und wenn wir irgendwelche Ankündigungen machen oder Posts, dann shared, was das Zeug hält. Gebt uns all eure Liebe.
Wir haben mittlerweile ziemlich signifikante Kosten. Wenn ihr es euch irgendwie leisten könnt, unterstützt uns doch auf Patreon. Dann kommt ihr auch in den Genuss verschiedener Vorteile, wie zum Beispiel Zugang zu unserer Discord-Community oder Zugang zu den ultrageheimen Patreon-Episoden, die wir dort posten. Außerdem könnt ihr uns natürlich auch über PayPal Spenden zukommen lassen.
Außerdem haben wir mittlerweile einen eigenen Online-Shop. Das heißt, wenn ihr euch immer noch fragt, was ihr euren Lieben zu Weihnachten, Ostern oder sonst wie schenken könnt, geht dorthin und kauft duftes Merch.
Alle Links dazu hier in der Beschreibung oder auch auf unserer Webseite 99zu1.de.
Vielen Dank fürs Dabeisein, danke für die Unterstützung und wir sehen uns in diesem Theater.